Hello, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable on rethinking Africa's future investment portfolio. My name is David McNair, Executive Director at the One Campaign. We fight for economic and opportunities and healthy lives in Africa. And it's a real pleasure to be moderating this session because I'm a long-term fan of the ISS future studies. We'll be hearing a lot about the latest study on financial flows. We know that Africa's financing gap is estimated to be about 402 billion through 2030, and that obviously poses a serious threat to achieving Agenda 2063, the continent's strategic priorities, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're hearing from the team from the Africa Futures and Innovation Programme at ISS, in particular from Dr. Marvelous Ndugu, who will give us a presentation on the new analysis on what we're likely to see from the latest data. And the latest analysis really shows us a kind of mixed picture. So on the plus side, remittances are now surpassing both aid and FDI as the largest external inflow. But we're also seeing that the positive consumption effects of remittances are not necessarily being transformed into long-term structural economic growth. And at the same time, traditional sources of FDI are stagnating. So we'll hear a little bit about why that is. We'll also hear another story, which is the scenario that the team has put together. A scenario where aid, FDI, remittances, and portfolio investments rise substantially. And that contributes to the continent's economic and social development. And we'll be hearing a little bit more about what are the factors that could drive that scenario. So in a sense, our goal today is to figure out how can we get from the status quo of stagnating and declining investment to this new scenario where the financing gap is filled and we're contributing to increased human development and economic goals. But before I hand over to Dr. Marvelous, I just wanted to hand over to Dr. Fonte Akum, who is the Executive Director of ISS, for some words of introduction. Fonte, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear participant, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on rethinking Africa's investment portfolio, which could not have come at a better time. Before we begin, though, I would like to pay a special tribute to Professor Maxi Schoolman, an ISS Board of Trustees member who we lost yesterday. Maxi has been a supporter of the Institute. She's been a dedicated servant within our ISS Board of Trustees as well. And I could not start without paying the special tribute to her, and hope that we can keep her, her in our thoughts and prayers as well. This conversation could not have come at a better time because Africa as a continent is differently affected by four horsemen of sort of a financial apocalypse on the horizon, some of which we'll be talking about today. The first, of course, is an unsustainable debt burden, which has become a priority of both the government of South Africa and the African Union within the framework of the G20 conversations. And I'm sure in the build up to the G20 and even after the G20, we'll be hearing a lot of talk about possible solutions to Africa's unsustainable debt. The second is a depression in overseas development assistance, which we have seen with sort of the shrinking of USAID and its ripple effect globally. And that's not helped by the reinvestment of Europe in its security due to the war in Ukraine. At the same time as African countries contend with public revenue generation through different forms at home. An attempt at public revenue generation, in fact, have been met with social backlash as well. So how do you navigate the political current of public revenue generation in this current context? I think that's a key issue as well. The third, of course, is this rethinking of migration, which has implications for remittance flows on the continent as well. And finally, we come to the major horseman, which is illicit financial flows. From the Pandora Papers in 2016, Panama Papers in 2016 to the Pandora Papers in 2021, there is always discussion about the illicit financial flows which extract revenue from the continent in favor of offshore accounts. All of this crystallize into extracting limiting the possibility for Africa's development outcomes. However, today we are going to be trying to look at some of the silver linings. I hope that through these conversations, we could highlight the opportunities for foreign direct investment that accrue to the continent, that could drive industrialization and the full implementation of the AFCFTA as well. I hope that we can have conversations around public revenue generation on the continent and better taxation. And I hope that we can actually also begin to tease out possibilities for addressing Africa's unsustainable debt burden. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all very pleasant proceedings and cordial as well. And I'll be listening in for a while. Thank you very much and best of luck. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Fonte, for that really clear explanation of the four horsemen. And hopefully, we're not in a truly apocalyptic scenario because there are things that we can do to shape the future. And Dr. Marvelous Ndugu is going to give us about 20 minutes of presentation in terms of the analysis of both the current situation, but also this really excellent scenario that has been developed by the team on what could be achieved if we were to put the right reforms in place. So, Marvelous, we'd love to hear from you. And then for those in the audience, we'll then turn to a panel discussion and we'll open up the opportunity for you to share thoughts and comments. So please do use the chat as we're going along, and then we'll address your comments as we go into the panel discussion. But Dr. Marvelous Ndugu, over to you.
Thank you, David, and good morning, afternoon, and everyone, wherever you are. I would like to share my screen. Thank you. David, can you please confirm if you can see my screen?
We can see it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So this presentation draws on our latest report on financial flows, which analyzes how capital moves in and out of Africa. And for those who would want to go through the report in detail, just go to our website and go to thematic. You'll navigate to the financial flows page. You have the option of reading the report online, or there is an option to download it for free. Then you can have a great detail of the snapshot that I'm going to provide here. So the central question is how Africa can better harness external flows to close its substantial investment gap and also to accelerate development. That's what we will be answering here. But before I go on to the main presentation, I would like to introduce you to the model or the forecasting platform that we use. So our analysis uses the International Futures platform, which is developed by Denver, by the University of Denver. So what this analysis does is that it models long-term global futures, and it also integrates the historical data with the system-based forecasting for about 188 countries. The good thing about it is that it is an open source software, so everyone who wants to use it is so welcome to do that. Regarding the full details of how you can access IFS, you go to the technical page of our website. There is a module that covers the international futures model in detail. But what I want to emphasize for the sake of this presentation is that IFS doesn't use a linear equation to derive its forecast. But what it does is that it reflects the dynamic interaction across economic, social, and environmental systems under prevailing policies in a certain country or in a certain economy. And for the context and for the purpose of this presentation, our impact assessment is based on how each modeled sectorial scenario compares favorably with the business as usual scenario, which we call the current path across the key development indicators. And our forecast horizon is currently up to 2043, which is the end of the third 10-year implementation plan for the Africa's Union Agenda 2063. Right, so we focus mainly on 8 sectorial scenarios on individual basis, starting with the demographic and health scenario up to the governance scenario. What we then do is to determine their combined impact, which we refer to as the combined scenario. So this combined impact is the synergistic effect of all the interventions contained across these scenarios, these 8 scenarios, which we want to see that if these interventions are combined, what could be their impact on the development agenda or the development trajectory of Africa or African countries or the regional economic communities within Africa. So today we are focusing mainly on the financial flow scenario, and what I will do is to just give a brief of the Africa's investment gap and the trajectory of the external financial flows up to 2043 under the current path. Then after then, I'll just give a brief aspect of each financial flow, starting with remittances, followed by foreign aid, illicit financial flows, and the foreign direct investment. Then I'll give also a brief of the conceptualization of our financial flow scenario, and I'll present the findings and end up the presentation with conclusion and recommendations. So, like David have indicated, we in Africa are facing an annual financing gap of over 400 billion until 2030, which far exceeds the current domestic financial resources. Our tax to GDP ratio average about 16%, which is far below the global peers. If you consider South America and also South Asia, they record levels above 16%. So what it means is that external financial flows are therefore crucial to cover the gap that is left by the domestic resource mobilization. And looking at the foreign aid, remittances, and FDI, we are expecting an increase under the current path. For foreign aid, we're expecting an increase from almost 65 billion in 2023 to about 101 slightly over 101 billion in 2043. Then remittances, we're also expecting an increase from almost 61 billion to around 94 billion in 2043. FDI, we're also expecting a rise from 76.4 billion to 229 billion, around 230 billion in 2043. this is under the current path, which is the business as usual scenario or the baseline trajectory. But we feel that this is not enough. There are some policies that can be implemented to push these flows above what the current path forecast indicate. Then the other interesting aspect that we gather from this table or from this graph is a shift on the financial flows composition, especially from 2016. You see that remittances have surpassed both the foreign aid and the FDI to become a single external financial flow in Africa. So this means that remittances has to be considered as part of the imported or as part of the critical financial development policies in the Africa. But what we have to emphasize is that in as much as we are drawing policies to attract more financial flows, but we still need to take care or pay attention to our domestic institutions that are needed to maximize domestic resource mobilization. Then moving on to remittances, which Africa has received approximately 90 billion in 2023. And within that 90 billion, 20 billion were transfers within the extra Africa flows. And the other point to note under remittances is that North and West African countries are top recipient of the remittances. Then these remittances are actually critical directly on sustainability of the household in terms of education, in terms of healthy. However, they've got a limited impact on growth. In Africa so far, I'm yet to find a study that have linked remittance-led growth. So that tells us that remittances are predominantly used for consumption instead of investment purposes. And it calls on for the African governments to shift their focus on trying to implement policies that will also tailor remittances across the development priorities, especially in the rural areas. And the other thing that African governments should pay attention on the remittances is the issue of the remittance trap, where government might actually find it reluctant to create jobs for its citizen on account that they are receiving quite as much remittances from abroad. And the other challenge that African countries are facing in terms of remittances is high transfer cost, which are approximately 7%. That's way above the global average. And also the issue of informal channels that persist in some African countries, especially in DRC. 85%, over 85% of the remittances are channeled through informal channels. So Africa needs policies to address the issue of informality in channeling recipient to the remittances to their recipients, and also in addressing the issue of the cost that are associated in sending out remittances. Then in terms of foreign aid, Africa records the highest per capita aid relative to peer regions, especially South Asia and also South America. And this is due to the widespread poverty and also the issue of the state fragility. what we have seen is that aid is critical, especially for low-income African countries, and constitute up to about 35% of the government revenue in this income group. But we are facing a big challenge in Africa, especially given the recent cuts from US and also from the UK. This move by the US and the UK, they pose serious risk, especially under the humanitarian sectors and also under health and partly on the education. There are quite a number of low-income countries that have been so much dependent on US aid, on aid from the UK and aid from the US in terms of financing their health systems and also financing their education, especially in rural areas. Then what it means is now that African governments should channel remittances to the targeted areas where it's needed most, rather than just misusing them. It's one of the greatest focus that needs to be done, the alignment with the priorities needed. Then coming on the negative side, which Fonte has also emphasized on, the issue of illicit financial flows, that Africa records approximately 89 billion annually through issues like tax evasion, through trade misinvoicing, through smuggling, and also through corruption. But what we have to also set as a record is, where is this money going from? So what we find out is that a greatest proportion, about 65%, is lost through commercial activities, which includes generally the trade invoicing, and the rest, 35%, is lost through the criminal and the corruption activities. So this alone tells us that the government has got a big task to do in curbing the illicit financial flows. This 90 billion annually lost in illicit financial flows could otherwise be directed for some of the development-oriented projects, especially under health and education. Then coming also to FDI, which is often seen as the most desirable kind of flow, because it doesn't just bring capital, but it also facilitates knowledge and skills transfer. So for the longest time, FDI has been considered as one of the critical external financing for development in developing countries, including in Africa. But in Africa, particularly, it has remained so modest. FDI flows to Africa in 2022, 2023. The continent attracted only about 3.5% of the global FDI. That's a small fraction, especially considering the size of Africa. Africa accounts for about 18% of the world's population. So we anticipate that, given that size and also its need in terms of development, it should attract more FDI than what it's doing now. So FDI are projected to reach about 3.5% of GDP by 2043 under the current path, which still we feel that is not enough to drive the development agenda of the African countries robustly. And this FDI, meanwhile, is mainly affected by the commodity booms. So Africa is receiving more FDI towards the extractive industry rather than the manufacturing, financial services, and other sectors. And in that regard, what we see, the fluctuation of the FDI flows mostly goes hand in hand with the commodity volatility in the global market, which is something that African governments should actually work on to make sure that we attract quality FDI beyond the extractive industry. The other issue is also the perceived risk associated with the African countries. This risk is attached mainly to the institutional quality. There is a perception that African countries, the institutional quality in African countries, deteriorating, and that is a turn-off to quite a number of investors. And some of the investors that are de-investing in Africa are actually citing this as the cause. So that's another point that the African government should also pay attention to. In terms of sources of FDI, Europe remains the largest investor in Africa. But unfortunately, we see that since early 2000s up to now, the investment from the European countries have been decreasing and steadily. It's a matter of concern and something that needs to be addressed. And the other traditional investor, also US, you have experienced a decline in the investment since mid 2000s up to now. It have even surpassed by the emerging China around 2010. So that should tell us that our traditional investors are de-investing, and we should ask our question why. So the theme of this seminar was drawn from this aspect, to rethink our investment portfolio given the de-investment that is happening in the African context. Right. A brief conceptualization of our financial flows. What we need is the external financial flows that enhance capital accumulation, that enhance technology, and also enhance skills transfer. So drawing from this outcome, then we asked ourselves, what should we do? That is the intervention. So number one, to increase capital, we need to increase remittances, we need to increase foreign aid, we need to also increase the FDI stock, and we also need to increase the portfolio investment flows from abroad. But above everything, we also need to check on the illicit financial flows, which are hindering Africa too bad. 90 billion per annum is quite a lot. So we need to work around on the policies to make sure that illicit financial flows are reduced. So once capital is accumulated, technology and knowledge transfers, there's much investment on that. The impact of it is, of course, economic growth, drawing from the classical growth theories. Then our findings shows that our scenario can be able to boost GDP, which is economic growth. So by 2043, we expect our scenarios to boost GDP by 240 billion above the baseline forecast of 6.36 trillion. Some might consider it as small, but it is considerable because this 240 billion is more or less the size of Egypt's economy. Egypt is one of the largest economies in Africa, so it's much. Then GDP per capita will be boosted by approximately 160 above the current path forecast of 6,050. Then most importantly, poverty, which is a very, very one of the issues affecting African countries. So extreme poverty, people living under extreme poverty will be reduced it down to 420 million, which is a favorable, given that 20 more million people from the current path forecast of 440 million people will be out of extreme poverty. Then we expect FDI flows to increase to 5.3% of GDP, which is about 1.7 percent points above the current path of 3.6. We expect a boost of net remittances by about 28 billion, above the current path of 94 billion. And also foreign aid, we expect it to increase to about 114 billion, which is 9.5 billion above the current path. So in the foreign aid, we take into account the fact that some of the major donors like US and UK have actually cut their investment, and we incorporated that into our scenarios. So yeah, what does this mean now for Africa? Number one, what it means is that we need to strengthen our absorption capacity. So external funds can only be effective if countries have the capacity to absorb and also invest them well. So government should make sure that the institutional quality provides that breeding ground for the investors, not only to attract, but to turn their investment into positive development outcomes. And some of the issues, apart from the governance that has to be enhanced, is also skills development and also infrastructure development. We cannot only depend on external, external financial flows. We also need to mobilize our domestic resources. So this calls for African countries to broaden their tax bases, modernize their tax administration, and clamp down, especially on the illicit outflows, to raise more funding locally. Then the other thing, like what I said before, that currently Africa attracts more of extractive FDI. So there is need for the African governments to strategically attract FDI that can go towards manufacturing, especially under agro-processing, given that greatest proportion of the African countries depend on agriculture. So we need investment that can focus on agro-processing. We also need investment that can focus on green energy transition, given our abundance in solar and also in critical minerals that are relevant in green energy transition. Then there's also need to leverage remittances for development. Like what I said before, that now remittances are more channeled towards consumption, but there are no initiatives that are put by the government to make sure that these remittances are also channeled towards investment, especially supporting the small to medium enterprises in rural areas, small infrastructure development like building of health facilities, schools, and etc. There is nothing. It's only for consumption purposes only. Then, given that we are experiencing some sort of cut in aid, there's also need to use aid more effectively. So what it means is that aid should now be treated as a catalyzing resources, not as a crash. So what African governments and their partners must do is to align aid to the national priorities, focusing especially on sectors where it can have that transformative effect. Then finally, we have to combat illicit financial outflows. Every dollar lost to illicit financial outflows is a dollar not invested in the Africa's future. So if African governments have that in mind, then I think we can work towards the crackdown of illicit financial flows. Yeah, in conclusion, what we gathered from this scenario is that external financial flows, be it remittances, aid, or FDI, they offer immense opportunities for Africa. They can help fill the investment gap. They can create jobs. They can reduce poverty, but they cannot substitute strong domestic policies. So the responsibility lies on the African governments to create some sort of an enabling environment where these funds are used wisely and strategically by improving governance, pursuing reforms. African countries can ensure that every $8, every investors, and every diaspora remittances works hand in hand with the domestic efforts to achieve the continent's development aspirations. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Marvelous. That was a really fantastic presentation. It reminds me of an old boss of mine who used to work for Barack Obama. And Barack Obama used to remind his staff not to simply admire the problem, but also think about what they could do to change it. And I think what you've laid out here is an alternative scenario. And I think what would be really useful in the next 30 minutes or so, as we're joined by Pierre Gimpo, who leads the Africa Growth Initiative at Brookings, and Yaki Sillers, who's the former executive director at ISS, is to explore a little bit of the how can we get this done? What are the levers that African governments can change? Because as you have rightly said, Marvelous, so much of the agency is within the power of African governments and other private actors to change. But of course, we also need to look at the inequalities and injustices in the international system. And this is not in a vacuum. We're facing a very volatile geopolitical period, so we need to tackle those issues, of course, as well. But maybe we can start with the kind of big picture, and maybe I can start with you, Pierre. Marvelous has kind of laid out, this scenario where Africa's GDP could increase by the size of Egypt's economy, reducing poverty by 20 million people. Can you give us a sense of your view on what policy shifts are needed to achieve that scenario?
Thank you so much, David. And also thank you very much for inviting me to this important discussion. I think Marvelous did an absolutely marvelous job in presenting, these key features of the situation. And it gives us a food for thought, but also push us to think a bit more deeply on how we can go forward. I think one thing that we could say, just as to summarize, is that we have to coordinate reforms that can unlock transformative growth in Africa, just to get back to your question. And we can do that in various ways in terms of policy shifts. So the first is, and this is basically things that are already being emphasized in the report, and I think it doesn't hurt to, re-emphasize it so that it becomes like a rule book of what we are trying to achieve or what we can achieve. So we need to strengthen illicit financial flows. I think that's a very important objective, and Marvelous already have stressed that in the report. And there are various ways to think about it. So, for example, we could prioritize e-voicing and customs, allowing us, for example, to trade in real time, trade valuations database, and also tighter transfer pricing enforcement. I think these are some of the things that we could do on the IAF framework. Then we need to improve the FDI climate and infrastructure, which means what? Let's make every incoming dollar an investment ready opportunity, right? And this implies, for example, pairing inflows with concrete absorptive capacities, right? And so it implies also to create reliable power and logistics, and more importantly, predictable regulations, because I think investors would like to see something that is not only transparent, but also predictable across the continent. So the report scenario assumes gains only materialize when inflows can be turned into capital formation and productivity. This is very important, right? If it's only the inflows and we are not trying to materialize it concretely on the continent, then it's not going to be transformed into the productivity and job creation and all this other output that we are looking for. Now, we also need to shift it toward capacity building and also domestic resource mobilizations, as it was mentioned earlier. And this comes from through broadening the base broadening the tax base. For example, it could take digital tax administration. We should be able to streamline the MSME regimes, and we should be able also to recycle gains into public investment. So, for example, in infrastructure, in health, in skills, in a way that crowds in private capital. I think those are some of the key things we need to think about. And one additional thing that we should be looking at, and it was also emphasized in the report, is how do we integrate remittances into the development planning, right? Because when you look at the way that the remittances are used, it's typically in terms of consumptions. We need to transform it in terms of production, in terms of channeling them into projects, right, that have high productivity or return capacity. So as a bottom line, I will just say that external money only becomes development when it buys productivity. And so that would mean fewer leaks, faster permits, and power that stays on. So let me stop here for now.
Thanks, Pierre. And I think that I love that quote. We should let's post that on social media. External finance only contributes to development when it supports productive activity. Yaki, I mean, you've been thinking a lot about the absorptive capacity in South Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think South Africa is positioned to, do what exactly Pierre said, and what would make it more ready to achieve, development gains from FDI? I think you're still on mute, Yaki.
Thanks, David. The classic mistake. Yes, I think we've released a forecast of South Africa, which is available on the website. So if you go to geographies and you drop down on the geographies menu, you'll find South Africa. You'll find every African country, and of course, South Africa is struggling on various fields. I think to regain investor confidence requires a mix of fixes, such as fixing the operating environment, just completing the unbundling of Eskom and expanding private generation, because our electricity prices have just gone through the roof, and the input. So our foundries are closing down, and input costs are just going up. We need to proceed further with port and rail concessions. Now, some progress has been made in that regard, particularly bringing private contractors onto our railway network. We need to professionalize key municipalities and digitize procurement to reduce corruption. The president earlier this week spoke to actually all the ANC local councillors to just tell them, guys, if you don't reduce corruption, if you don't turn the poor delivery of water, electricity around, the ANC is going to fall off a cliff with the local government elections next year. And in actual fact, all the polls in South Africa indicate that that's exactly what's going to happen in the larger metros, urban areas like Johannesburg, where the ANC's support is really tanking. We have to strengthen the rule of law through not only better policing, but we have a spate of murders and vigilantism in South Africa that is really a cause of great concern. It is as if South African public have lost confidence in the ability of the police and the criminal justice system, generally speaking, to provide security. And at the moment, we have 2 commissions of inquiry that is looking at the extent to which criminal organized crime has penetrated the state. But we've had many commissions of inquiry on corruption, organized crime in South Africa. Our problem is not knowing what the problem is. Our problem is, in actual fact, action, leadership, and clear direction, reform, and appointment, ending issues like cadre appointment, which is the appointment of politicians or well-connected individuals to prominent positions instead of relying on competence. And of course, there's a difficult balancing act, particularly with Black economic empowerment, which government has to manage. We have to change the ownership of our economy, but that is something that you do best by supporting education and health and the input into quality. So there are many things that we need to do: scaling renewables, unlock the grid, which is our major constraint on electricity. Water is becoming a big problem in South Africa, modernizing freight logistics, and so on. We can speak about many of them. These issues are all in the public domain. And South Africa has got significant depth in its capital markets, its know-how. It used to be one of the most industrialized countries in Africa, and it did that by beneficiating its gold. South Africa was 20, 30 years ago the world's major gold exporter. We built an entire industrial ecosystem around our gold exports, also diamonds and a few others. And now much of that is focused on our vehicle export market. But the problem in South Africa really is issues of accountability, corruption, poor governance, poor leadership. So I think if we look at those issues, then we recognize the extent to which, in particular, the way in which government has undone the management of our state-owned enterprises is really a huge challenge for the country. You would all have heard of the Zondo Commission and the inquiries about state capture that has happened in South Africa. We really need to move forward on not only unraveling what has happened in the past, but setting clear goals and targets for how we are going to unlock South Africa's potential. We still are a major player in Africa. We are the major player in Southern Africa, certainly, but it's like we're trying to swim in mud at the moment, and we really need to unlock the entrepreneurial opportunity, an export-led, growth-orientated economy, and South Africa can do much, much better. And you know, we can wax endlessly about all the reforms that need to happen. It's not that we don't know what needs to happen. It's that simply the implementation and removing many of the inhibiting policies that have constrained growth in South Africa. I'll stop there, David, before I get too excited and carried away on this.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think my key takeaway from what you've said is that all of these things are interconnected. We can't treat FDI as a separate issue that we address without addressing rule of law, corruption, leadership, all those kinds of things. And of course, these aren't issues that are, I mean, I sit in Europe. These aren't uniquely African issues. They're challenges that face us everywhere, but we need to be tackling this in a comprehensive way. You've also touched on one of the issues that was raised in the chat, and please keep the comments and questions coming. But this question about benefiting from natural resources and making sure that there's value addition and not just exploit of raw resources. And that gets to a third question that I'd love to ask you, Marvelous, which is the kind of international perception of Africa as an investment destination. We know, that this can have material effects on the cost of capital, for example. There's the report from Africa No Filter earlier this year about the news reports of Africa being dominated internationally by reports of election violence, and that's shaping investor perception among the kind of, the big holders of capital globally. But do you have any views on how African governments, civil society, business could start shifting that perception? Marvelous.
Yes. So one aspect why the risk perception is high, or the so-called risk premium, is that most African governments is not made available on public the data that is needed to calculate that risk. And we know that investors depend on what is available publicly. They make judgment on their risk return trade-off based on that. But African governments should work on make sure that such data needed to calculate, to come up with a risk perception is made available. The other thing is also, it goes back to what Yaki was saying. So financial markets and investors in general, they are so sensitive to information. So if it happens that there is some sort of corruption happening in the country and it goes out there, investors take into account that very seriously. And it might take a very long time for the African countries to be able to rectify that. One of the issues that Yaki has indicated is in South Africa in particular is the issue of Zondo Commission. It have tainted some sort of an image of South Africa, and they've destabilized the investment landscape of South Africa. We have conflicts in different countries. In Angola, in DR Congo, we still have war. In Sudan, we have got war. But if you look, these are the countries that are rich in natural resources, where foreign investors should be actually going there for investment. But in such a state, you cannot expect any productivity outcome to come there. So there's the issue of information. That's number one. Information should be made publicly as possible for the investors to be able to ascertain their return against the risk that is perceived. Number two, there is the issue of the governance. Institutional quality in Africa should be reformed, and African countries should make sure that their business regulatory environment is conducive not only to attract investors, but to turn that investment into positive development outcomes.
Thanks, Marvelous.
Thank you, David.
So we've spent a bit of time talking about the investment landscape and FDI and how these things are interconnected. There's been a lot of discussion about remittances, which are the largest now external financial flow, and how those can be converted or maximized from a majority consumption-based use of that resource to investment and growth. So I'd love to spend a bit of time on that, and then spend a bit of time on the internet or the illicit financial flows issues. And Pierre, you've given us a very specific issue or solution to that issue around e-invoicing and customs. But on the remittance front, Yaki, do you have any thoughts on tools that could be used to kind of shift from this consumption-based approach to a more investment-based approach, given these are personal financial flows, they're flowing between families and so on. It's not that we have traditional political levers in the way that we would have with public money.
Absolutely.
David? Sorry.
Go ahead, please, Yaki.
No. I actually wanted to throw the question to the audience, because there's been a bit of discussion in the chat function of exactly this, because I'm also intrigued by exactly this question. But Pierre, please go for it.
So, totally, I think that's an amazing question, because as Marvelous showed in the report and the extraordinary work that has been done, we can see that remittances have been stable and impactful, but it remains under leverage. I think we usually treat remittances mainly as private consumption, but there is a huge untapped potential attached to it, and we can think of a lot of opportunities that these remittances can bring. So in terms of concrete policy, one thing that I will start by saying is that we need to lower the cost of remittances. The costs now are still very, very, very large. The SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal, state that it has to be lowered to 3%. We are not even there yet. So there has to be an effort to lower the cost toward at most a 3% factor, and this can be done through, for example, real-time payment rails, interoperable mobile money, and also in a way that drives competition on this market. So in order to be able to lower this competition, the second thing that can be done with these remittances is to promote diaspora bonds and investment platform, so that the member of the African diaspora have a clear understanding on where their money is going, how can it be used to achieve the set goals, right? And this can come in the form of offering a safe and simple saving and investment on-ramps products. And these are the type of things that we can think about, right? So the issue of diaspora bonds or diaspora funds with aging options and transparent use of product. And I think there are some countries in Africa that are already taking that steps. There is Kenya, there is Ghana, there is Nigeria. I think Nigeria now stand up a very large diaspora fund. And this is an important way to show direction. So essentially, we should be thinking on how we link these remittances to savings, to insurance, and how to boost small and medium-sized enterprises. So remittances, I would say, are Africa's quiet giant. And in order to unlock the potential of remittances, we need to lower the fees, we need to build the on-ramps, and we will be able to unlock a domestic investment engine.
Thanks, Pierre. And what's interesting about that is that, we can all lament the, poor quality of political leadership, but these are fintech, private innovations that could be unlocking these things. And I know there's a very live discussion about, as the US cuts its funding for health, are there ways in which these diaspora funds could be supporting health insurance products that could be both lower cost, but also at the forefront of health innovation? So that's a really kind of optimistic, take on that. Killian and Lead, I'd love to bring you in on this remittance question before we move to the IFF's question. Do you want to come in briefly on this?
Yeah, good almost afternoon, in fact. So yeah, I'm Killian Clifford. I lead IOM, International Organization for Migration, UN Migration, work on remittances and diaspora investment, and then just sort of some points of clarification around how we think about remittances. As you said, David, and as presenters have said, they are person-to-person flows. They pay for health, they pay for school fees, they pay for food, they pay for rent, they pay for everything that kind of leads to human capital development. And it's not that these generally are being misspent on, 50-inch TVs or PlayStations or whatever. They're essential spending for people back home. So the debate isn't necessarily around rediverting that money that goes to all those essential expenditure for families that are left back home. More rather, how can you encourage diaspora investment into sectors of the economy that are more productive? But that's not to divert flows that go into remittances to become more productive. And I think that's the kind of terminology we need to just be aware of here, because remittances are generally paid out of income, and they're paid every month. Often it will be the recipient who will determine how much is needed. I need X for school fees, I need X for lights, utilities, for health expenses, whatever. But often migrants will also have some savings, and it's the savings that they spend to invest. Primarily from our work, it's often property. A property back home is the first destination for that. And maybe it's that flow is that could look to be redirected into service sectors of the economy that are more aligned with national development plans and could be more productive. And we are seeing active reach out by different governments. Kenya has a State Department for Diaspora Affairs that sits in the Foreign Affairs Ministry. Also, similarly with Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde, just I don't know if you can see my camera, but they've just launched their diaspora investment policy. That's in Portuguese, if anyone can read that. So there is active engagement by the countries in Africa to reach their diaspora, and many are implementing policies that will look to almost hold the investors' hands, desperate investors' hands, through the whole process of getting an account locally, to navigating the legal frameworks, et cetera, so they can maybe they invest in sectors and SMEs. So I mean that's to be encouraged for sure. But just to on the debate about redirecting remittances to this sort of work, I think this area, I think it's to flow should be considered differently, and indeed they're recorded differently as well on national accounts. So that's all I wanted to add in that one. Over.
Lee, did you want to come in very briefly on this, and then we'll move to the illicit financial flows question? Dr. Lee, are you there? Perhaps we can kind of come back to that then. But on the illicit financial flows question, I mean, I think part of the challenge that we have with this issue is a data question around, measuring, what is by definition, seeks to be hidden. And I mean, I've done a lot of work on this in the past. We did a lot of work in the international space in terms of, the facilitatory role of legal firms, banks, the beneficial ownership legislation that was taken forward in Europe. Much of that has been rolled back both in Europe and the US. And therefore, it's almost like a kind of like whack-a-mole kind of problem where you're kind of, addressing some part of it and then it kind of pops up somewhere else. So what I liked about your suggestion, Pierre, is that it is something very practical and implementable that can be done at the national level, rather than kind of, putting the blame or kind of trying to address these things in an international way where it can just pop up in other ways. But Marvelous or Yaki, do you have any kind of other thoughts on specific implementable policies that could seek to address this illicit financial flows issue?
I can, David, in the chat function, I made the comment that something that we've been calling on for some time is just an issue of absolute, what we refer to as radical transparency on all government loans and transactions, because the best way of dealing with these issues is to try and shine a light on them. We don't know the debt commitments of many African governments, and quite a number of leaders have come, if we think of Zambia, have come into power and then realized that in actual fact, the debt burden of their country is significantly worse. And then, of course, others, we have a situation like we have in Mozambique some years ago, where the government engages in all kinds of illicit, corrupt deals with foreign banks, basically to fund election campaigns and, of course, private coffers. So there are lots of, these are all highly technical and difficult issues to do, but basically we need to strengthen financial transparency by mandating public disclosure of beneficial ownership and ensuring alignment with international standards on money laundering and terrorism financing. South Africa at the moment is trying to get out of the FT grey listing, and it's taken us 2 years to get out of it. And that means the cost of money in South Africa has really gone through the roof. So we need to establish a central beneficial ownership registry accessible to regulators, media, civil society. Enforcement capacity, such as financial intelligence centers, need to be reinforced. But this all needs political commitment. And tax authorities and specialized prosecutorial units with clear performance metrics, and prosecution and asset recovery need to be established. And in South Africa, we have many of these mechanisms, but what we don't have is accountability. And this is essentially, ultimately, a political desire by a leading government. If we think, for example, years ago under the leadership of Meles Zenawi, how Ethiopia changed its tax income dramatically by really focusing and making sure that resource tax income was transparently done, the spread was, and that there's a degree of clarity on what is raised. So open contracting, e-procurement, transparent recording of financial flows, all of these things could be done. They're all highly technical. Modern technology allows us to do some of it, but all of it requires a governing elite that is committed, that wants to deal with this and not hide behind it. Because the problem is that for political, ideological, personal reasons, some of our leaders don't do that. And that ultimately is really the problem. And if your leadership, your political leadership is not committed to dealing with this, then the fish rots from the head. It trickles down. And it really is huge problems. And we see with that in South Africa on a daily basis. We have all the instruments, but what we need is real commitment and action from leadership.
Okay. Pierre, Marvelous, did you want to come in on this point? If not, we've got another question about prioritization of ODA in the chat that we can move to, but anything burning that you wanted to share?
Yeah, yes, David. So yeah, Yaki is right. So there is need for the African governments to join international initiative, especially for tax transparency and also adopting digital trade tracking to detect misinvoicing, and also improving cross-border cooperation to repatriate the stolen assets. But all these issues lies around transparency. If there is no transparency within the government, then this mechanism will always be there on paper, but the implementation will be poor. Yeah.
Thanks, Marvelous. So Pierre, maybe you could take this next question in the chat about, with declining aid flows, how they should be prioritized. So there's a question about both, the geographical focus, should it kind of go towards more support to low-income countries that have less access to capital markets, but also within middle-income countries, should it be used to try and catalyze FDI? And of course, we had the whole billions to trillions narrative, which never really happened. But I think it would be useful to kind of dig into why that didn't happen and if there are more efficient uses of this scarce and declining resource. Pierre, over to you.
Yes, David. So I think, as has been said before, there has to be a clear scorecard on the type of, in the way that these resources are being used, but also an efficient policy on the type of sectors that this fund need to be allocated, right? And this comes from really understanding the economic landscape of each country, of each region, and also the interrelations between regions. We talk a lot about regional integration, and this has to come in effect to allow, for example, value chains across countries, comparative advantages and complementarities to be truly effective. And so if all these internal assets and systems are exploited, I think we will see more and more of those funding being effectively productive in the continent.
Thank you, Pierre. So we've gone into the detail on FDI, on remittances, on illicit financial flows. We'd love to hear more questions from the audience. If you have any, please put them in the chat. But maybe we can kind of zoom out a little bit and kind of think about, the countries that have successfully shifted from aid dependency to investment-led growth. I'm from one of them. I'm from Ireland, which was, a poor country in the 1960s and is now, I think, second in GDP per capita in the world. And that was a combination of, tax policy, investment policy, targeted education to attract tech and pharma sectors and so on. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of lessons that we can learn from countries that have successfully made this transition?
Well, you've already highlighted one of the key success stories, and of course we can also go back to the Asian tigers, to China itself, and look how countries used aid in a very targeted manner against the advice often of the aid givers by building their capacity. I mean, think of South Korea, a country that was considered to be hugely corrupt, that took its aid money and domestic resource mobilization and invested in heavy shipbuilding and all kinds of stuff that everybody said, you guys are crazy. And look at South Korea today. There are many of these examples where, but it all comes down to having a plan and having a vision and proceeding on that. I mean, one of the most successful, now this is use of remittances and aid and so on, was for Ethiopia to construct the Grand Renaissance Dam, which has the potential of transforming Ethiopia into a net energy exporter and to provide electricity to a large portion of its population. That was done, of course, against the resistance of Egypt and everybody else and investors. But Ethiopia did that, like South Korea, the Asian tigers, based on its own vision of where it wanted to go. It made its own assessment, and it did that. And this is often what I think is missing in much of Africa, that there's no clear pathway. We sort of bumble along, we get pushed around by donors and by the IMF and the World Bank, instead of making a clear commitment. For example, if you want to grow, you need to fix health and education. Those are the long-term drivers of prosperity, investment in human capital. But these investments takes decades to realize. It takes 18, 20 years for a child to go from being born and emerging at the other side of the educational ladder with the ability to contribute significantly to an economy. And in that journey, by the way, aid to low-income countries can play a very important role. And I see in the question, Hans raised the issue of what should aid not go to low middle income or to middle income countries and de-risk investment. Yes, a portion of aid should certainly do that, because Africa struggles with a negative risk premium. And quite a few studies have recently been released that just points to the fact that Africa, which gives you the highest return on investment of all regions globally, suffers the highest risk premium. It's crazy. Of course, because Africa is treated as if it's, all of Africa is a basket case, and it's violence and instability and corruption. And of course, one can just point at what's happening in the United States to know where real state-led corruption is happening. I think it's so. But I think eventually the critical thing, and our work also points to that, is that Africa needs to get the continental free trade area going. Our markets are too small. Our individual countries are too small to attract foreign direct investment and to open up markets to trade. And that is now progressing. And I must say our work indicates clearly, and we do every sector across African countries, that slowly but surely the stars are also aligning for Africa on various ways. I think the purpose of this, so when we say that growth comes from labor, capital, and technology, from a labor perspective, we've often made the argument that Africa is several decades away from potentially achieving a demographic window of opportunity. Our analysis shows that Africa enters that potential window in 2050, 2052 on average. So we are 2-3 decades away from achieving that, and it will only realize if you invest in education and health and so on and so forth. In the meanwhile, you need to focus on money, on capital. The need to find a way to unlock much larger capital flows into Africa and to reduce illicit flows, mobilize foreign direct investment, remittances, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's the issue of technology, and we all speak about AI and so on. But the reality is Africa won't develop if you don't do two things. You need to provide household electricity for ordinary Africans, and they need to be connected to the internet. If you don't have those two things, you cannot leapfrog. So capital, technology, those are the things that can potentially provide short-term benefits. But much of that requires the implementation of the Continental of regional trade agreements that probably will start at a subnational level and roll out. Sorry, long answer and stuff. But
thank you, Yaki. Yeah, and I mean, I guess part of the debate that we're seeing with the cuts to ODA are not just the decline of finance, but also the decline of influencing of those donors and the fragmented influence that often pulls governments in lots of different directions, which could end up being an opportunity if there is political pressure and the opportunity to say, actually, here is our plan, we're going to drive it forward. And I think there's a real need for that to happen. I want to do a quick plug for the poll that's just been put up on Zoom. We'd love your feedback on these sessions and how useful they are, and so that we can improve them in the future. So please answer that. We've got 14 minutes left, so I'd love to bring Dr. Laid, if you're there, in, and then we'll move to kind of start concluding the session with feedback from each of the panelists. But Dr. Laid, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, David.
Morning.
Thank you for having me on your program. Good morning to everyone, and of course to Yaki. Hello, Yaki. Hi. My question, well, it's not a question, actually, it's more a comment. As you may know, last week we had Algiers was the host of the Inter-African Trade Fair, and frankly speaking, it was very tremendous success. My question is, or my comments, I would say, don't you think there is still hope for Africa to take off the ground and really start implementing African continental trade area, as well as towards the implementation of Agenda 2063? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laid. So given we've got just a few minutes left, what I want to do is to kind of incorporate your question, Dr. Laid, into our kind of concluding comments. And in a sense, the kind of broad framing question, just as a kind of thought experiment, is, and for each of our panelists, Yaki, Pierre, and Marvis, is if you were advising the AU or a national treasury on the key things that they needed to prioritize, given how little bandwidth governments have, to promote African-led growth, what would it be? And if it's related to the AFCFTA, then hopefully that responds to Dr. Laid's question as well. Yaki, do you want to go first, then Pierre, then Marvelous?
Thanks, David. I actually want to ask you to also give us a bit of some feedback from the work that the One Campaign has done. I mean, you guys have done wonderful work on financial flows, on debt, and all of these kind of stuff. So maybe you can also give us some highlights from your findings. I've already pointed to what our work, our analysis refers to, the importance of the continental free trade area, for ways to find Africa to get to a manufacturing transition. We need to deal with our energy shortfalls. We've done a big study on just the extent of Africa's energy deficits. But none of this, all of these things, none of them is possible without more stability, with more security. And this brings us to difficult choices. And we often ask ourselves the question, does more democracy necessarily mean that countries become more stable? You know, we have a situation in South Sudan at the moment where the warlords who have been fighting have carrying on fighting. And I was this morning wondering what would have happened if one of the warlords, in actual fact, just ran South Sudan. I mean, I'm now, in a sense, being ridiculous in my response, but without a degree of stability and security. nothing else is possible. And we have this debate about the sequencing of democracy and development. And increasingly, I'm coming down to the view that security comes first, because without security, nothing else is possible. It sits uncomfortably with my desire for human rights, democracy, inclusion, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the history, particularly of the Asian tigers, of China, all the successful countries in South Asia, if you compare them to the countries, for example, in South America, and we've done some work on these, then you see that government effectiveness is in actual fact more important than democracy. Now, this is a dangerous statement to make, and I myself struggle with this, but the reality is that those countries have reduced poverty more rapidly, improved GDP per capita more rapidly than the more democratic countries in South America. And, the world is changing at the moment. Global power is shifting. We're at the end of the liberal international order or whatever. But I think our work says to us, Africans need to focus on the quality of governance, not necessarily that these be liberal democracies, because the problem always is there's no better alternative to democracy, but maybe it really is that democracy should deliver accountability and transparency more than it should deliver on all the other bells and whistles of a liberal democratic dispensation, because we're really struggling in South Africa, in the continent, with providing rule of law, a safe and a secure investment environment. And this is not a nice argument. This is a very difficult, contested, grapple with yourself kind of argument. But I think that there's something there that I think we need to unpack and that we need to explore a bit more. To go back to the example of South Sudan, there just seems to be no end to the ability of the warlords to fight one another and to destroy their country further. And our response to that is you need a negotiated settlement, you need elections. And I wonder if that really is the answer. I don't have any other answer I should add, but that's just mine. Thanks, David.
Jackie, and that gets really to the heart of one of the big questions that I think is live globally now. In that, if you look at the polling, even in Europe and North America, on the younger generation's support for democracy, they don't have confidence that democracy gives them a vote because they think, the institutions have been captured. They also don't have confidence that it's delivering on cost of living and economic opportunities and so on. So this is not just an African question; it's a global question which is being addressed. And thanks for your kind words about one. I'll say more about that in a moment. But Pierre, maybe you could share some concluding remarks.
Yes, David. No, absolutely. I think Jackie is absolutely right on everything that he said. And so follow up on that. I would say create a Pan-African investment standards and transparency framework under the continental free trade area, and which means a continental-wide framework that harmonizes rules for investors, right, and create a system of public-private partnership, debt guarantees, etc. And so the reason why it's important is that it speaks to almost everything we've been talking about today, right? Predictability and transparency is the number one concern of global investors, right? And so if we are able to reduce this regulatory fragmentation across countries, across 54 markets in Africa, that immediately lower the risk premium and also reduces the cost of capital. And also the unified framework has the capacity of helping African governments also negotiate from a position of strength, avoiding the race toward the bottom in terms of tax holidays or opaque concessions, right? And also it directly crowds in all the external flows that we've been talking about, whether it's FDI, blended finance, diaspora capital, because it gives an institutional, framework to investors to be confident. And finally, it also cuts illicit financial flows, because by tightening all this disclosure and harmonizing this anti-avoidance rule at the continent-wide, it's going to be extremely difficult to keep leaking financially. So bottom line is that if we create a system, an ecosystem where there is predictability, it's going to lower the risk, and lowering the risk is going to be, I would say, the cheapest way of unlocking billions in private capital.
Thank you, Pierre. Marvelous.
Thanks, David. The good thing about giving remarks last is that I have to just summarize what others have said. But I see quite a lot have been covered regarding aid, remittances, and illicit financial flows. But I feel we haven't covered enough when it comes to the state of the Africa investment portfolio, which is becoming more multipolar, and especially given that the traditional investors, as we saw on that graph, that EU and US, their investment towards Africa is declining drastically. So that needs to be addressed, and both Prof. Pierre and Yaki indicated the issue of sorting out the domestic issues that are affecting, especially the governance, to make sure that we attract and retain foreign investment at scale. But what I also want to emphasize is that the shift to the multipolar reflects some sort of broader geopolitical rebalancing. It offers Africa more options, but also demands strategic clarity. Africa shouldn't be trapped in a position where it can align with a certain investor and dislike another investor. At this point in time, it's fragile to do so. So Africa must position itself not as a passive recipient, but as an assertive partner, one that shapes terms, one that screens investment for development impact, and also the leveraging of the Africa Free Trade Initiative to speak with the unified voice. So we need investors across all the African countries. Lastly, I like the example of the East Asian countries that Yaki demonstrated. They use the aid to build export infrastructure. They use the aid to build education systems and industrial capacity. After then, they phased it out as FDI and trade took over. So what it means, it's a very big lesson for the African countries. Aid must not be strategic. Aid must be strategic, not permanent. We should strategize aid just to move from one place to the other. After then, we avoid independence and sustain ourselves. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Marvelous. Throughout the session, I had been jotting down kind of summary comments, and Marvelous has just shared them all. So thank you for doing my job for me, Marvelous, and for also the excellent analysis in your presentation. So to just in by way of conclusion, Yaki asked me to say a little bit about the one campaign was started 20 years ago. It emerged out of the Jubilee debt campaign, which resulted in about $110 billion of cancellation of illegitimate debts. And since we've done a lot on World Bank reform, we did a lot on unlocking special drawing rights during the COVID pandemic. And really kind of listening to the needs and demands of African governments and civil society and reflecting those in G20 countries. But what we're seeing more and more is that the political incentives of those countries, particularly Europe and North America, but not only, are really to kind of move towards an every person for themselves world. And I think the kind of my reflection from both this session, but also the work that we're doing globally, is that it's more and more difficult to get multilateral agreements and to get governments to do things that, or kind of based on make decisions and investments based on moral arguments. We need to move towards making arguments for mutually self-interesting, interested and supportive investments. And for African countries, I think that means that there's no one coming to the rescue if there ever was. We need action plans, as Yaki said, and we need the implementation of those action plans. But we also need to recognize that in a shifting world, it presents opportunities. Often in these international debates, I see African governments or countries represented as kind of pawns in this geopolitical battle. Actually, I think what we're seeing much more is that there are opportunities for leverage on issues like critical minerals. We've seen that in Namibia. And actually, you can play these big geopolitical players off against one another to get the best deal. And therefore, we need governments to be coming together with a plan, with a long-term vision for collective bargaining, and for ultimately, growing economies and becoming an economic player. Because in a might mix world, in a might mix right world, those that have power, economic power, military power, diplomatic power, are those that get to have a say. And we need to move towards that vision, where African countries have a meaningful seat at the table, not a tokenistic one, but they are power players in the decisions that are made globally. And we need to keep fighting for that. We need to keep generating the ideas and analysis. But also ultimately, we also need to keep pushing for our government leaders to also support that vision and to be held to account for implementation. So with that, we're 1 minute over, and thank you everyone for an excellent discussion. Thank you to ISS and to Marvelous for the excellent analysis, to Yaki and Pierre for the comments, and for everyone for their feedback, comments in the chat. And we'll keep in touch, and please do reach out. I'm sure we're all on LinkedIn and so on, and if you'd like to continue the conversation.